Okay, thanks Nicole, and again welcome everyone to this webinar. Where I'm going to be talking about how to manage Leucaena once established. So this is the second webinar in a series of two. I delivered the first one in September, which was more about the establishment side of things of Leucaena, whereas this one's more about how to manage Leucaena once it's established. Now I'm going to try and get my thing to work here. Okay, so before we launch into some of those sorts of topics and content, just wanted to quickly have a yarn about what Leucaena does for grazing systems, just quickly. So basically, there's a number of aspects what Leucaena can do: improve live weight gain through high quality feed. It can enable high stocking rates because it does provide more feed in the paddock when it's included with grass. And if it's all functioning correctly, it can supply nitrogen for those companion grasses, which helps those grasses grow and have a high quality, primarily protein concentration. So think of it as a organic and high quality supplement for cattle, basically. So it's a perennial system, grows there year in, year out for 30 plus years. So it's a very productive long-term system. The background to this presentation is quickly, so yes, Leucaena is very productive. There's been numerous studies that have shown that, but it needs to be well managed and also established to start with, but well managed for best results. So I'm going to be talking about some of these aspects today. Don't forget that we're talking here about a grass legume system, or in this case, a grass Leucaena system. And so the actual concepts we're going to be talking about is to think about as a system rather than just the Leucaena plant itself, because we need to, or graziers need to manage a grass legume system here. So we'll talk about how they interact and what we can do about that. So the premise of this presentation today is about, okay, Leucaena has been successfully established. Now we want to know or talk about how to manage and to maximise the returns from that successful establishment. So what needs to be done to really manage and maximise the productivity and the actual returns too. Again, before I launch into this current webinar, just to recap on the last one, it was titled How to Reliably Establish Leucaena. There were a number of factors discussed there, including the climatic needs of Leucaena, the soil requirements of Leucaena, and then I spoke about three aspects of the establishment from planning, preparation and planting. So if you missed that webinar, it's available on the Future Eve website. The actual links there is shown on the screen, and you can download that and listen to that at your leisure. So, so again, I won't be covering off on any of those aspects today. There isn't enough time to do that. So, but if you're keen to learn more about those aspects, go on to that webinar and have a look at that at your own time. Okay, so the outline of this webinar is going to be twofold. As Nicole mentioned, we'll be splitting this into two, with questions after the first section and after the second section. The first section is about what sort of issues or what things to think about during what I'm calling the establishment period. And that period I'm defining here as from planting through to, say, the first 12 months of growth, basically. So while that crop or the actual Leucaena is establishing. And the things we will talk about here include weed control, timing of first grazing, insect management and other graziers as well, or other issues that might be coming along. And the second part is about, okay, once we've gone past that 12-month period and it's fully established, so from 12 months to 30 plus years, what are the aspects that need to be considered or could be an issue, including weed control, grazing, rumen bug management, height, nutrition, and insect management as well. So there's a fair few things there to get through. So again, I won't talk about these in much detail, but just sort of hopefully cover off in the main points for you to consider or to think about in your own situation. Righto, so we'll launch off into the first section about what are the sort of things that we need to think about during the establishment period. So again, I'm defining this as between planting, so just after planting up until that 12-month or so period. So the concept or the aim here is to really set up the actual crop for a 30-year life, really, and to have a really healthy, vigorous plant going into that first winter period of time, which for most of us in Northern Australia or Queensland and so forth, is that's usually cool or cold and can be quite dry too. So we want to have as big a plant as possible going into that period, and we want to minimise the period to the first grazing. So we want to again have a healthy, vigorous plant, so the actual period of non-grazing is minimised. Things to think about there include effective weed control, the timing of the first graze and how to do that, psyllids or other insects as to what might be issues there, and how to deal with other grazing animals, so i.e. non-cattle grazing animals like roos or other things as well, because they can be issues when the crop is quite young and small. So we'll talk about those 4 aspects. Okay, so weed control. So Leucaena is notoriously slow to grow. It's a very poor competitor with weeds when it's young. So the photo on the left-hand side here shows a young Leucaena crop might be a month or 2 old, so and still quite small. Basically, the actual plant is soon after planting, it's putting a good robust root system down first, and therefore the above ground growth can be quite slow, and therefore if there's any fast growing weeds and so forth, it can really outcompete the Leucaena. So Leucaena is a poor competitor, and therefore the concept is that need to control weeds for up to 6 months after or post planting. Now, whether it's 3 months or whether it's 9 months depends on the situation, but the rule of thumb is for at least 6 months to have weed-free around the Leucaena rows to get to and now enable the Leucaena to grow as quite the fast as possible to again to have that good, robust, healthy plant as I mentioned earlier. How can we do that, or how can graziers do that? Well, basically there's 2 techniques. One is either in-row cultivation. I have a photo down here on the right-hand side of some in-row cultivation occurring. That's in-row cultivation is very effective, has been one of the more historical ways, I suppose you could say, of controlling weeds in around those Leucaena rows. But there are also some registered herbicide options for post-plant use, so after planting use as well. And they include, to control grasses, the registered option or trade name, or an example of, is called Fusillade Fort. It's a selective grass herbicide that will only control grasses, and the registered rates are between 1.65 and 3.3 litres per hectare. So that comes off the label of the product. So you can legally spray that product and or only control weeds. It's really effective or best when the weeds or the grass weeds are small. Really struggles when the grasses have any decent size about them, and you might have to either go to a higher rate or maybe bring in some cultivation if the actual weeds or the grasses are too big. The second product that's registered for post-plant use is a product commonly called Spinnaker. So Spinnaker is one trade name of this chemical, Imazapur, I think it's pronounced. So again, there's numerous trade names of that particular chemical. Spinnaker is one of those, but that's what people commonly call it because it was the first product on the market. So the rate registered for Leucaena is between 70 grams and 140 grams per hectare. It's mainly used as a pre-emergent, so you basically apply the chemical on, it needs to get washed into the ground and basically gets taken up by the germinating weed seeds in the ground. So it needs to be applied therefore before the weeds are present ideally. Now, because that product is quite commonly used and is quite effective as well, I just wanted to cover off on the permit that allows graziers and the industry to utilise that product legally. So it's actually under a permit system, and that's at the front page of the permit there. And currently the permit holder is the Leucaena Network, and the permit runs until March 2023. So, but again, because it's commonly used, I just wanted to run through some critical use comments in particular, or critical use aspects of this product just so you are aware as to how it does work and how to get the most out of it, basically. So if we work from the top here, we've got conditions of use. So basically products to be used, so Spinnaker or other registered products with that active ingredient in it. It's registered for butterfly pea and Leucaena for certain broadleaf weeds and grasses. So you will note there that no particular broadleaf weeds or grasses are specified, it just says certain, so pretty broad spectrum there. And the rate again is specified 70 to 140 grams. Now most graziers would use 100 to 140 grams per hectare. It's probably a more typical rate, and I'll explain why in a second. So if you look at the critical use comments, It specifies here, apply either pre-plant, at least 2 weeks prior to planting, or post-emergent when the legume, in this case being Leucaena, is at least 7 days old and weeds are very small. So in effect what it's saying there is that the application window is 2 weeks prior to sowing, or effectively around about 2 weeks after sowing. Now this is in contrast to probably how most graziers use it. Most commonly it's probably used either or applied at planting. So most or some guys have a spray boom behind the planter and apply this product straight after or as they plant, or they come straight behind with a separate operation either that day or the next day or two and apply it then. Those uses are basically off this label, which means possibly it could be an illegal use of the product therefore, but again that's typically how most people use it though. It mentions here also do not add crop oil to any application, use the higher rate for longer term weed control. So yeah, 70 grams will be just as effective if all is going well and it's applied appropriately and so forth and so forth. It just won't give as long a residual, whereas 140 grams will give 6 months or so. Now, the length of the residual will depend on the rainfall, as how much rain you get. The more rainfall and sandy the soil, the shorter it works for. The less rainfall and the more heavier or more clay in the soil, the longer it will work for. Also talks about only one application per legume crop. That's not really an issue. There is a withholding period. Do not graze for 14 days after application. That again isn't usually an issue, and is registered for use in Queensland, the Northern Territory, New South Wales and WA. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that down here in the additional comments section, it says here, persons who wish to prepare for use and or use of products for the purposes specified in this permit must read or have read to them the permit, particularly the information included. Hence the reason why I've gone through this. So what it's basically saying in my summation is that you must have read this permit to legally use that product. Righto, so we'll go on to the next aspect in that establishment phase or period about first grazing and timing of and how to. So the aim or the concept here is to set up a perennial plant, being Leucaena in this case, for a productive life, which can be 30+ years, ideally with minimal height issues going forward. Now that's far easier said than done, but this first grazing will have a large impact as to how that plant will be productive, will produce going forward, and what issues you might have or don't have with height. So when should first grazing occur? In my opinion, around when those Leucaena plants are about 1.5 or so meters tall. Now I've heard graziers tell me that they've grazed Leucaena a lot shorter than that and it's come back quite well. I would suggest that's a fairly risky thing to do, but can be done if there's good moisture in the ground and the conditions are right and so forth. But I would suggest that you want to try and make sure that plants are large and robust before the first graze occurs, but not too tall as well. So I'll talk about that in a second. So what are the critical steps? So I believe the concepts are to have a short duration. So you bring the cattle in, have them there for a short period of time and take them out again. Don't expect to get a large or a long graze in that first instance. My next point is about daily monitoring, and it might not be daily, or might be every second day or third day, but the point there is to monitor what the cattle are consuming, because if they've had no experience with Leucaena before, they might not even touch Leucaena for a week or two, and therefore you might think, oh, well, they probably chewed it out and you come down and they haven't. So or if they have had experience with Leucaena before, they might hook into it quite quickly. So you want to make sure you don't flog it too hard in that first graze instance. So again, monitoring daily or every couple of days, I think is going to be critical for those aspects. And then once most of the leaf and the growing point, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, once that's removed, take the cattle out. So again, it's short duration generally, for a short period of time, therefore, graze what leaf is there, take off most, if not all the leaf, remove that growing point, then pull them out and wait for it to regrow. And my last point here is don't worry about the rumen bug, and I'll talk about the bug in a minute as well. But I think at this point in time, probably don't need to worry about the bug at this stage because the duration of grazing is going to be quite short. Okay, so what does this look like height-wise? So here's a picture here of a colleague standing beside very young Leucaena. And I think that, I mean, he's around about 6 foot high. I think that you've got good grass in between. The Leucaena's growing very, very well. Time to put the cattle in. So I think that'd be ideal time for the first graze to occur. And the concept is to remove the leaves off the plant here, but also, as I mentioned earlier, to try and remove this growing point. So as you can see here, we've got a lot of taller or tallish runners, and the concept is again to break those off. And so you basically remove that apical meristem, that growing point in the plant, and that encourages the plant to bush up from lower down sort of this part of the plant here. So, and you'll note here, most likely would have noted that psyllids have been causing some issues with this crop here in particular at this time, and they've defoliated those taller runners as such. So here's a picture here of some young roosters. Yeah, not so now, I suppose, but again, of a very young Leucaena crop with some very good grass in between, some roads grass in between. I would suggest here that you probably could put the cattle in there at that time. I mean, against shoulder high on me, a bit short on Ken there, but I would expect if you do put cattle in there at that time, the cattle will tend to graze this grass quite heavily, and possibly not even touch Leucaena for a week or two or so, and so that might mean that will allow this Leucaena to get a little bit bigger by the time they actually do get onto it. So again, from there, regular monitoring is going to be critical, but I think that could be a stage there where grazing could commence. And this last photo here is a crop, a photo I took many years ago from a situation in southern Queensland. This Leucaena was planted into a fully prepared seed bed, about 12 months old at that stage. Again, a few sort of fellows here looking at some tall branches and so forth. I would suggest there that stage is well and truly, the plant's well and truly big enough for grazing to commence there. Again, it'd be nice to sort of break these tall runners down to try and help the plant bush up, or encourage the plant to bush up from lower down in the actual base of the plant and so forth. The other issue is that obviously there's no grass there at that point in time, so there's going to be an issue as to when grass should be included and how grazing should occur from there. So I think one of the issues about leaving grass inclusion until this stage is to when grass should be planted and how you manage grazing to try and minimise this plant here from growing taller and taller. Okay, next aspect in this establishment period is about insect control. Insects can cause significant issues post-planting. So as a picture here shows, those plants are quite small, only a couple of weeks old. Any insects that are floating around at that point in time can set these little fellas back quite heavily and quite nicely. So insects need to be monitored for, and the main ones to think about is above ground insects or above ground soil-based insects such as earwigs up here, and some false wireworm. There's a larvae and a beetle there. They can cause big issues with Leucaena, particularly if you are planting Leucaena into existing or a situation where you've had a pasture there for some time. Psyllids can also be an issue, and other sap-sucking insects as well. Excuse me. And so I would suggest strongly that you need to monitor young crops, particularly at this stage here for psyllids, particularly again if you've got the right environmental conditions for them to occur, because any setback at that young stage can cause big issues with growth and development and so forth, and you'll be waiting longer and longer to graze it and so forth. And lastly, grasshoppers can be an issue too. I mean, not every year, but grasshoppers can devastate young Leucaena crops as well, and they need to be assessed and thought about too. So what can be done about these insects post-planting? Well, above ground soil-based insects such as the ones I showed before, so earwigs and so forth. There's a product called beetle bait, basically cracked grain, some insecticide and some vegetable oil as the attractant, works quite well. If you've got psyllids, there is a registered product called Omth, and one trade name or one product is called Roga, registered at 340 mils per hectare, very effective on psyllids. And I would again suggest that if you've got psyllids in high numbers at that young stage, that it's probably economical to spray to ensure that those plants do grow unchecked. Grasshoppers, unsure as to what can be done really legally from an insecticide point of view, but I have looked up, and Regent is registered for pasture or in pasture. What pasture is, it doesn't specify. So again, maybe you could argue that Leucaena is pasture. So, but again, I think it comes back to monitoring the situation and try and work out the best course of action from there. Other animals, other grazing animals can cause big issues in young Leucaena, particularly during that establishment phase. And other grazing animals include kangaroos, wallabies, hares, emus, pigs, you name it, just about, they can cause issues. So, and that photo there on the right-hand side just shows there is some Leucaena there. I think there's a row there, and there's a row somewhere over this side here, just demonstrating the impact that in this case here, this was in southwest Queensland, hares were giving this little Leucaena an absolute toweling, and you can see that you know, those plants are really, really struggling, and they're coming out of this sort of shade or treed area over here. Late or early plantings are highest risk from this issue. So particularly in central Queensland here, or in Queensland, if you plant late, plant say, I don't know, March, April maybe, when the grass around the whole district is low quality, you've got this lovely fresh high quality feed or crop being Leucaena. I'm sure every grazing animal within Kui will find it, and that's what happens. So those late plantings are very high risk from that aspect. And also if you've got Leucaena paddocks also up close to shelter belts or large shade camps and so forth, they cause issues too. So control options, yeah, unsure, but some concepts here. Plant a large enough area. So in theory, the concept there is to basically have enough Leucaena on the paddock. So yes, if you lose a few rows, that won't make a big impact to your overall production from that paddock. So a large enough area being, I think we would argue 100 acres or 50 hectares or so, or larger would be a good size. Anything smaller, the actual impacts of these little animals can have is significantly higher. Again, don't plant out of season. Try and plant at the time of the year when there's green grass in the district to, again, you know, even out that grazing pressure. Dare I say it, scout and deter as best you can. And possibly in worst case scenarios, probably fence off some areas if you can, and if it's easy to do so. So, but again, all those options need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Okie dokie, thank you. Righto, so again, so that's covering off on the first 12 months or so after planting. So we'll talk about from once the plant is established now, from year 1 onwards to 30+ years. And there's a range of aspects here that I just want to cover off on. Again, there's quite a few of them. I think there's 6 there in total, and therefore won't be covering off on these in too much detail, but again, I can talk about those later on. Actually, I think there's 7, sorry, I can't count. So yeah, we'll launch into those pretty much straight away. So first one's weed control. So yeah, generally weeds aren't a big issue once our Leucaena is established and the grass is established. If you do put grass in at the same time, you know, once everything's established and good to go from there, after 12 months or so, weeds aren't a big issue. But sometimes we do have issues with broadleaf weeds in particular, and they can be hard to manage because the herbicide availability from a registration point of view is very limited, if not non-existent, to be honest. And again, whatever products are or could be used might have a detrimental impact on the Leucaena itself. So the other bigger issue probably is more about volunteer Leucaena. And that's primarily caused from the actual original planted rows getting too tall, setting seed, and that seed, you know, obviously falling down the ground somewhere and then germinating down the track. So so it basically comes back from, yeah, dare I say, I suppose, letting the actual plant do that, and that's really not a good thing to do from a production point of view, but also from obviously a seed set point of view. There's also can be issues with poor or no competition from grass. So in some situations where the grass struggles to I suppose keep up, or there are issues with drought or other issues, and there's limited to no grass, that can exacerbate the issue as well. So because there's no competition from that How to address? Well, again, it's probably going to be a case-by-case basis, but again, here's some basic principles or some theories to think about. I would suggest that if you've got tall Leucaena that's out of access for cattle to graze and setting seed, I would either heavily graze or suggest to heavily grazed, but probably more likely slash or chop those rows down back to a more manageable height. Spray or cultivate out any volunteer plants in that interrow area. And I think it'd be more cultivating rather than spraying because they can be quite robust, these little fellas, unfortunately. Encourage, or most likely, again, probably replant some grass if the grass isn't there or very, very thin. And again, from there, manage grazing to minimise height issues going forward. But it can be easier said than done. So there's some concepts there. Some photos to just demonstrate that. So here we have a photo of some really well established Leucaena growing, and we've got a bit of grass in the foreground, but a lot of broadleaf weed in the background there. So, and this can typically happen particularly on heavier cracking clay soils where getting grass established can be quite difficult. And if it's established to start with, and if it's grazed out or droughted out over time, very hard to get the grass back in there again. So in that situation there, I would suggest that need to put some sort of mechanical control, herbicide across that to control those weeds there, broadleaf weeds, and then either let what grass to thicken up over time, or most likely put some more grass seed out and encourage thickening up from there, and again from there manage grazing to suit. So again, a long road to hoe, and unfortunately quite difficult to address. Other situation I mentioned is about volunteers. So here's a photo here of the original rows of Leucaena with some seed pods and so forth, and a lot of volunteers in between the interrow area. So again, what to do about those? Well, again, I would suggest that any tall rank Leucaena needs to be chopped down or grazed heavily, but if you can't pull them down by animals, slash or chop them down, and then work out a way forward to manage these volunteers, which I think will primarily come back to what the old comment was about cold hard steel or cultivation, basically, because I don't think these, in this case here, spraying would actually do much long term. So, and again, there are some registration issues as well. So I think it comes back to cultivating it up and maybe either letting this grass come back if there's plenty of grass seed in the ground, or reseeding and getting more grass back that way. But that's unfortunately a pretty difficult one to deal with as well. Okay, what about grazing long term with your long term Leucaena? So I'll sort of say a few comments here that yeah, might not be that palatable, I suspect, but anyway, I'll go ahead anyway. I believe grazing management is one of the most critical aspects of getting the most from your Leucaena grass pastures. So it's a really important aspect to get right. And I also think that a lack of grazing intensity at certain times of the year, in some cases, is one of the biggest failings that I see when graziers graze Leucaena. So I'm not saying that's the case for every situation, but I don't think that graziers really graze Leucaena pastures intensively at certain times. So what I'm saying here is that Leucaena equals higher grazing management intensity. It's a more complicated system. It really means more monitoring of your pastures compared to a grass-only paddock, far easier to manage. Whereas when you include Leucaena, or any legume, but Leucaena in this case here, there really needs to be more monitoring of that pasture over time to just monitor what's happening and how it's going. There's also going to be more ongoing maintenance of that pasture. So that might be chopping, as I mentioned earlier, or it could be fertilising, it could be more weed control, it could be whatever it might be. But basically it means more higher grazing intensity, but also more maintenance of that pasture long term. And therefore, Leucaena is not about set and forget. So you can't just plant it, put the cattle in there and walk away. It's really about the monitoring and maintenance over time to get the most out of it. Again, sorry, if I go back a step here, page up, here we go. Sorry, so yeah, so it's about set and forget. So yeah, don't do that, basically is what I'm trying to say. So it's a system that needs high management intensity, basically. So again, can get away with not grazing as intensively or not monitoring as readily as you need to, and you'll probably still will get some reasonable production from it, but to get the most out of it, that's what needs to be done. So what should be done in theory with the grazing side of things? And again, this is easier said than done sometimes, but this is the theory as I see it. First aspect is about matching stocking rate to the available feed. And I know that sounds quite simple, and that's what our general extension messages are across any grazing system, to basically don't flog or, don't rest your pastures too long. You want to utilise that grass, but or your pasture, but you want to basically match your stocking rate to that feed that's grown. Now with the Leucaena system in particular, there are many cases or many times when the Leucaena might be growing and the grass isn't, or vice versa, but generally it's more the Leucaena grows somewhat before the grass might do because of its big extensive root system. So, and therefore there might be some theory or some thoughts to put cattle in before really they should be put in as such. So again, it's a timing thing, but also want to basically match the stock numbers with how much feed's there. And again, the amount of edible Leucaena in a paddock is generally quite low. Actually, it's quite surprising. It might look visually to be a lot of material there, but the edible component is usually quite small, and much less than what there is of the grass if there's a good grass body of feed throughout the paddock. So there's usually a fairly small amount there overall. The next point is to rotate cattle through a number of paddocks. So I'm saying here that in my observations, and I suppose my probably personal preference, but I do think that it's right that a rotational system of some sort gets the best out of your Leucaena system. So not saying that set and forget doesn't work, but I think to get the most out of it, a rotational of some sort will definitely be beneficial. And that really means about entering or having cattle enter that paddock or your paddocks before Leucaena is budding or flowering, because once it starts to bud and flower and start reproducing, the quality of the leaf drops off and the production of leaf drops off. So, basically therefore production is declining. And graze until there is some leaf remaining and there is some grass remaining obviously as well, but yeah, leave a little bit of leaf left on the Leucaena, so when the cattle are taken out, those leaves are like solar panels. They collect sunlight, they convert that sunlight into sugars and so forth, and help the plant to recover as quickly as possible. Again, monitor what plants are being consumed. So monitor regularly, whether it's monthly, whether it's daily, whatever suits your situation, but monitor what the cattle are doing. Are they eating Leucaena? Are they hammering the grass, or what are they doing? And if you monitor, you can hopefully manage the actual grazing intensity and take cattle in, take cattle out, put more cattle in as such, or spell and so forth. So really important to monitor what they are doing. And if you do monitor and you are getting some issues, such as if your Leucaena is getting tall or dominating, basically the concept is to increase stock numbers, so increase your stocking rate when cattle are actively targeting Leucaena. And that generally is when the grass quality is low. So again, in a typical scenario, typical average year, which never occurs obviously, but for the sake of argument here, cattle will consume a larger proportion in their diet of Leucaena either in the springtime or in the autumn, coming in the winter time when the grass quality is low. So if you've got tall or dominating Leucaena, then that's when you should put cattle in there and try and graze it hard, because that's when they're going to actively target Leucaena. And then moderate stock numbers when grass is being consumed. So again, the flip side is that if you've got tall dominating Leucaena and not much grass, moderate your stock numbers when cattle are actively targeting grass, which is typically in the summertime when the grass is lush and fresh as such. And that comes to the next point here. Again, if you've got grass dominating, which is fairly rare, to be honest, again, it's pretty much the flip of what I just mentioned earlier. So if you've got grass that's dominating, increase stock numbers when the grass is being consumed by the animals. So again, in the summertime when they are actively targeting grass, increase your stock numbers then, and vice versa at other times of the year. So some photos. So here's a photo here of some pretty well-grown Leucaena, and I would argue here that the bulk of the feed here of the Leucaena is most likely above the height of access with the cattle. So you've got a lot of, in effect, wasted feed from a dietary and live weight gain point of view. So I would suggest here that basically put the cattle in and graze what they can take off that. Obviously, we've got some reasonable grass, but again, I think we've got more Leucaena than grass ultimately. So there'll be some monitoring to occur here from a grass point of view to make sure they don't graze that grass, excuse me, too heavily, and then bring in some sort of slasher come chopper and bring that down and try and reset it a bit and try and get a better height about it, and to be able to therefore be able to graze it more efficiently going forward. Here's the situation here with Leucaena that's again relatively tall, but is setting seed basically, which is in my opinion, from a productivity point of view, a definite negative. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the leaf production, which is what the animals are consuming, is reducing at that point in time. So basically, grazing should have occurred well and truly before then. And again, it's seeding, which is not what we want to see from many aspects. Next photo here shows, again, some pretty well-grown Leucaena, some nice grass as well. In my opinion there, grazing should start there and should put cattle in there and try and graze off what they can. In this case here, they probably will eat mostly grass potentially and probably nibble on the Leucaena or have a small proportion as their diet is Leucaena, when their diet is Leucaena. So, but if it don't start grazing it soon, these will keep going and keep growing, and potentially they have some height issues going forward. The situation here, obviously cattle are clearly in the paddock grazing away very happily, looking quite nice. My thoughts here are that grazing is close to finishing. So again, the concept is to sort of graze what Leucaena is there, leave a little bit of lift behind, maintain a good body of grass in between, pull the cattle out and let it recover. This situation here, I believe that the cattle shouldn't be in there. It should be spelled. We've got some regeneration of the grass coming back here, some lush fresh shoots there. That'd be nice to let them recover as fast as possible, because again, the grass is a little bit thin, and we want to try and maintain that grass coverage as best we can going forward. So in my opinion there, I think therefore cattle shouldn't be in there. And this situation here does occur quite commonly too. Unfortunately, we see many paddocks with no or very short lush grass. We've got some really healthy Leucaena that's growing quite well. What do we do from a grazing point of view? Should we put cattle in there? Should we not? I suppose the argument is if we delay grazing, which I think would be the best concept here, to be honest, to allow the grass to recover as best it can. In the meantime, the Leucaena will be growing quite quickly. So. And this is a good photo here of a situation where we've got end of grazing, so grazing has occurred, the cattle have left, we've got most of the Leucaena being consumed with a good body of grass in between. It's quite dry in this situation here, but again, we've got most, if not all, of the Leucaena has been consumed off the plant with a good body of grass in between. Moving on to the Rumen bug. Leucaena does contain a toxin mimosine. It's a toxic amino acid. It's quickly converted to a product or products called DHP in the rumen, which is also toxic to the animal as well. So this photo here just shows some symptoms here, including hair loss, salivation, weight loss, and so forth. So typically the animals, if they get enough of this toxin in their system, so when their dietary intake of Leucaena is above an arbitrary 30%, we can start seeing salivation here, hair loss, particularly tail hair and so forth, and obviously the animals just don't perform from a weight gain point of view. The solution and recommendation is to drench 10% of the animals with the Rumen bug or Leucaena bug. It's a bacteria called Synergistes jonesii. It's an anaerobic bacteria, won't survive in environments where oxygen is present, including the water troughs, dams, any water source. Therefore, it basically only survives in the rumen as such, because the rumen is an anaerobic environment. And really important, I suppose, the important point there is about, don't obtain your rumen fluid or your rumen bug and pour it in the trough or the dam and expect it to survive, because the bacteria won't. Cattle need to be on Leucaena or consuming Leucaena for the bug to survive. And there's a whole sort of range of aspects about that. To obtain the rumen bug, you can call the DAF call centre 1324 523 and get hold of the tick fever centre at Wacol, and they can send you up some rumen fluid in a bottle. So and that's yeah, it still is occurring today. Basically, there has been some new research looking at the rumen bug and whether it's needed to have or to actually bug your cattle going forward. The research is showing or indicating there are potential for other ways of detoxifying the actual toxins in Leucaena. And they've also found this particular bug, this Jonesii bug or bacteria, in various animals across many countries across the world. Generally in low concentrations though, but they're finding it's quite endemic across a large number of ruminants across large areas. So I suppose the bottom line is well, should we actually bug our cattle or not? And I suppose I'm saying here that yes, the recommendation is still to dose your cattle with the rumen bug, but as future research occurs, that might demonstrate that inoculating cattle might not be needed going forward. But at this point in time, the recommendation is still to do it. Height management. Bottom line is all Leucaena varieties can grow into tall trees, therefore needs to be managed not to get that way or to do so. And some concepts or some ideas as to how to minimise that. Well, in the first instance, to select the right row spacing when planting. Now that's going to be difficult after you, but that's an important consideration to basically, if you think you're on very good productive soil types and don't want to go to the expense of chopping every now and then, maybe wider rows might be for you. Vary grazing pressure over the year. So again, as I mentioned earlier, when cattle are actively targeting Leucaena, put more stock in there to try and bring those tall branches and so forth down and minimise that height going forward. Make sure there's a good competitive companion grass in amongst Leucaena, because that will definitely compete with Leucaena from a moisture point of view and slow its growth down somewhat. Be prepared to slash or to chop it and do it when needed. I think that's going to most likely going to be a way of the future that many paddocks will have to have routine chopping or slashing going forward, unless you can manage it otherwise. But I think history has shown that can be quite difficult. So ultimately, you have to sort of work in with your management style and your environment. So again, if you want good soil types, good fertile soils and frost-free areas, wider rows might be better. I might need to be prepared to slash more regularly. If you don't want to go to the expense of slashing and don't want to go to the expense or hassle of having more intensive grazing system, maybe have wider rows and try and reduce the amount of Leucaena in the paddock. Therefore, again, some photos. Again, chopping there would be advantageous. There are numerous chopping contractors around, and this is just a photo of one of those. Can basically effectively bring tall Leucaena down into some reasonable stuff to go from, and that's the result there. Nutrient management, really important, and I know that I'm running out of time here, Nicole, actually. I'm just looking at the time. High-performing pasture system, there is an ongoing need for high nutrient supply. Think of Leucaena as a crop rather than as a pasture. It's a high-performing crop, high-performing pasture, needs to have adequate nutrition going forward. If not performing as expected, look at nutrient supply as one of those causes potentially. Be prepared to fertilise in crop at some stage going forward, particularly if you're on soil types that are low in phosphorus or low in nutrient or have had a history of grain cropping in the past. They'll be the ones where you'll need to fertilise more regularly. Phosphorus and maybe sulphur are common limiting nutrients. Again, soil type, past history are good indicators, and solutions are to both test the leaf and undertake soil tests. From both of those testing, you can determine whether nutrient supply is an issue and also what to do about it, what product and how much and so forth, and how regularly it has to be applied. But you will need basically both the leaf and the soil test to actually do that. Insects, not really an issue generally, particularly in inland areas, but coastal areas or higher humidity areas can have psyllid issues. So psyllids and brown soft scale are the two issues generally that we have with insects. Brown soft scale, just quickly, there's a photo here. There's these little brown lumps are the soft scale on the stem there. And the way forward with that, again, there's a couple of options here. Minimise stress. I think there's a concept that if the plant's under stress, there's more scale there. Bit difficult if you can't irrigate or do other things to minimise water stress, but that's why I've got a question mark there. Manage grazing, make sure you don't have tall rank Leucaena as such, that's old. Can basically spray white oil or equivalent type product to suffocate the actual scale. That works effectively. Ants can harbour these things. Like ants can actually harvest them and bring them up the stem, so maybe controlling those might be an option too. And ultimately slashing and removing the old wood could be an option as well. Psyllids, the sap-sucking insect, again prefer humid locations, therefore more prevalent in coastal situations. Solutions, there's probably four or five solutions there. Basically just let them do what they want to do and wait for conditions to change, because they don't like really hot, dry conditions. They will basically reduce the numbers and go elsewhere and so forth. Most graziers, if psyllids are there, graze the remaining leaf off, because that's basically their food source. Can either slash it or chop the Leucaena down again, so utilise this as an opportunity to do that. Could spray with the methylate again. So Roga is a product there. Again, registered for psyllids, quite effective. Might provide 3 or 4 week control. But again, for new plantings, variety selection, we've got a new variety being Redlands available now. That's highly psyllid tolerant. One to graze and Tramba are psyllid, I suppose, tolerant as well, but not as great or as much as Redlands are. So again, with new plantings, could look at varieties to overcome psyllid issues. Psyllids, this is what they look like. A very small little flying insect that can affect just defoliate the plant. This is a result here. Again, leaf drop, basically defoliating the plant entirely. And this photo here was just showing that in some cases we can see a front, so psyllids can come across from one end of the paddock. This case here, they're coming towards where I'm standing, taking the photo. You can see there's no leaf there, and there's a leaf over here, so they can come through in fronts. Just be aware of that. Monitoring for escapees, very important. Regularly monitoring any Leucaena plants outside the planted paddock. Basically, if they are where they shouldn't be, definitely control them. Access and diesel at 1 to 60 litres is registered for that use, and again refer to the Leucaena Network's code of practice on their website as shown there. So conclusions, Leucaena is a very productive, high quality plant, but really needs ongoing monitoring and maintenance to get the most out of it. Weed control is critical, ongoing grazing management is critical, ongoing nutrient management is critical, and don't plant it if you aren't prepared to manage it properly, because it is more complicated than a grass-only pasture going forward. Again, thank you very much for listening. I think we're out of time, but here's my contact details, phone numbers, email, and I reside at the Parkhurst office in Rockhampton. So thanks for listening. Any quick questions, or not sure if you have time, Nicole, do we?